The great hall of the Galactic Council stretched for miles in every direction. Crystal walls rose high into the artificial sky, and hundreds of different species sat at curved tables arranged in perfect circles. The air hummed with translation. Devices working overtime to convert thousands of different languages into something every being could understand. Ambassador Jake Morrison sat quietly at the human delegation table. His hands were folded on the smooth surface in front of him, and his eyes watched the ongoing debate with growing frustration. For the past 6 hours, the same argument had been circling like a broken record. The crystalline hegemony accused the Void Runners of crossing into their territory near the Andromeda Gate. The Void Runners claimed they were only following ancient migration routes that existed long before the hegemony claimed that Space.Jake had heard the same dispute 12 times in the past year. Each time, he and his team had found solutions. They proposed shared patrol schedules, temporary passage agreements, and even offered to station human peacekeepers in the disputed zone. Each time, both sides agreed to the human proposals. Each time, within weeks, someone would find an excuse to break the agreement, and the fighting would start again. Captain Lisa Hayes sat beside Jake, her tablet filled with notes from months of diplomatic work. She had spent countless hours in private meetings with both sides, listening to their concerns, finding common ground, and building trust. Her efforts had prevented 3 wars and saved millions of lives. But none of that seemed to matter to the other council members. The Zephyrian delegate was speaking now, his tall blue form gesturing dramatically as his words filled the chamber. High Counselor Vextar had ruled his people for over 2 centuries, and his pride was legendary throughout the galaxy. His voice carried the authority of age and the weight of tradition as he addressed the council. The human solution is insufficient, Vextar declared, his golden eyes scanning the chamber. These short-lived beings cannot understand the deep complexities of our ancient conflicts. Their emotional responses cloud their judgment. They see only the surface of problems that run deeper than their brief lifespans can comprehend. Jake felt his jaw tighten. He had been listening to variations of this speech for 3 years. The humans were too young, too emotional, too primitive to understand the sophisticated problems of advanced civilizations. Never mind that human mediators had successfully resolved over 400 major disputes since joining the Council. Never mind that the galaxy had experienced its longest period of peace in recorded history under human guidance. The Nexari representative nodded in agreement with Vextar. Counselor Prime 7 spoke in the measured tones that characterized his logical species. The Zephyrian observation contains merit. Human decisions are influenced by chemical reactions in their brains that produce what they call emotions. Logic suggests that beings controlled by such reactions cannot make objective judgments about complex situations. More nods around the chamber. The Eternals remained silent as always, their ancient faces showing no expression. The various smaller species looked nervously between the major powers, unwilling to contradict the dominant voices in the council. Jake looked at Lisa, who gave him a slight shake of her head. Not yet, her expression said. Let them finish digging their own grave. Vextar continued his speech, his voice growing more passionate with each word. For too long, this council has allowed primitive species to influence decisions that affect civilizations millions of years older than theirs. The humans have been useful servants, yes, but servants should not sit at the same table as their masters. The word hit the chamber like a physical blow. Servants. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. Around him, he could see the human delegation stiffening. Captain Hayes closed her tablet with a quiet click. Dr. Ben Rodriguez, their chief science advisor, slowly removed his translation earpiece, but Vextar was not finished. He stood taller, addressing the entire council with the confidence of someone who believed he spoke absolute truth. I propose that we restructure this council to reflect the natural order of things. Ancient species like the Zephyrians, Nexari, and Eternals should hold full voting rights. Younger species can serve in advisory roles, contributing their perspectives without the burden of actual decision-making authority. This would include removing the human delegation from their current position, Prime 7 added helpfully. They would retain observer status and could continue their mediation work under proper supervision. The chamber buzzed with quiet conversations as representatives discussed the proposal. Jake noticed that none of the major species seemed surprised by this suggestion. How long had they been planning this? How many private meetings had taken place without human knowledge? He thought about the past 3 centuries of human service to the galaxy. Human engineers had designed the hyperspace network that connected distant worlds. Human doctors had ended 3 major plagues that threatened to wipe out entire species. Human peacekeepers had died protecting alien colonies from raiders and invaders. Human diplomats had prevented countless wars through patient negotiation and creative compromise. And now they were being told it had all been the work of servants who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve their betters. Jake stood slowly. The movement was quiet, almost gentle, but somehow it drew the attention of the entire chamber. Hundreds of alien eyes turned toward the human delegation table. The buzzing conversations faded into silence. Ambassador Morrison, Vextar said with barely concealed satisfaction. Do you wish to respond to our proposal? Jake looked around the chamber one more time. He saw species that humanity had saved from extinction. He saw representatives from worlds that existed only because human scientists had found ways to heal their dying sons. He saw beings whose children were alive because human doctors had cured diseases that their own medical science could not touch. And in their eyes, he saw nothing but agreement with Vextar's words. Jake reached into his jacket and withdrew a small device. With deliberate care, he placed his translation earpiece on the table in front of him. The tiny click as it hit the surface seemed to echo through the vast chamber. High Counselor Vextar, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. For 3 centuries, humanity has served this council with honor. We have bled for you, died for you, and sacrificed our own interests for the greater good of galactic civilization. He paused, looking directly at the Zephyrian leader. If our contributions have been nothing more than the fumbling efforts of primitive servants, then perhaps it is time for you to manage without our interference. Jake turned and walked toward the exit. Behind him, he could hear chairs moving as the rest of the human delegation stood to follow. Captain Hayes fell into step beside him, her expression calm but determined. Dr. Rodriguez and the others formed a quiet procession toward the chamber doors. The aliens watched in stunned silence as the humans filed out. This had never happened before in Council history. No species had ever walked out of the session in progress. As Jake reached the massive doors, Vextar found his voice. Ambassador Morrison, where are you going? Jake paused without turning around. We are going home, High Counselor. If you believe you can build a better galaxy without human involvement, we wish you success in that endeavor. The doors closed. Behind them with a sound like distant thunder. Within hours, a message went out to every human facility, ship, and outpost across the galaxy. The words were simple, but carried the weight of an ending that would reshape the universe itself. Directive 77. All personnel return to Sol System immediately. Cessation of all interspecies cooperation protocols, effective immediately. The day humanity walked away from the Council had begun. Commander Alex Turner stood on the observation deck of Kepler Station and watched the stars through the massive viewport. The station floated in space between 3 different star systems, serving as neutral ground for trade negotiations and diplomatic meetings. For 15 years, Alex had commanded the human peacekeeping force that kept this place running smoothly. His communication device buzzed with an incoming message. The priority code made his stomach tighten even before he read the words. Directive 77 flashed on the screen in bold letters. All human personnel were to return to Earth immediately. No exceptions. No delays. Alex stared at the message for a long moment. He had known this day might come, but seeing it in writing still felt like a punch to the gut. Around him, the station hummed with its usual activity. Alien traders argued over prices in the marketplace. Diplomats from a dozen species worked on border agreements. Engineers maintained diffusion reactors that powered everything. None of them knew that their world was about to fall apart. Alex activated the station-wide communication system. His voice echoed through every corridor and chamber as he spoke. Attention all human personnel. Report to Docking Bay 7 immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, all human staff report to Docking Bay 7 now. Within minutes, 43 humans had gathered in the bay. They were engineers, security officers, medical staff, and administrators. Some had worked on Kepler Station for decades. They looked at Alex with confusion and growing concern. We're going home, Alex said simply. All of us right now. Questions came fast. Why? What happened? Can we at least finish our current projects? Alex held up his hand for silence. The Council has decided they no longer need human assistance, he explained. They believe they can manage galactic affairs without our primitive interference. We're giving them exactly what they asked for. Dr. Jenny Walsh stepped forward. She had been the station's chief medical officer for 8 years. Alex, I have patients in the hospital wing. 3 Nixari children with quantum flux syndrome. If I leave now, they'll die within a week. Alex felt the weight of command pressing down on him. Transfer them to the Nixari medical facility on deck. 12. Give the alien doctors all your research notes and treatment protocols. They won't understand the treatment, Jenny protested. The Nixari approach medicine like a math problem. These children need intuitive care, constant adjustments, based on how they respond. I've spent months learning how their systems work differently from our medical books. Then you better teach them fast, Alex said quietly. We have 6 hours before the transport ships arrive. Across the station, the evacuation began. Engineer. Pete Collins shut down the backup systems he had installed throughout Kepler Station. The aliens had their own technology, but Pete's human-designed modifications had increased efficiency by 30% and prevented dozens of system failures over the years. Sir, Pete said to Alex over the comm system, the main fusion reactor is acting up again. The alien engineers never could figure out why it goes unstable every few months. I've been manually adjusting the plasma flow to keep it balanced. Alex felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. Shut it down to minimum power and leave detailed instructions for the maintenance crew. They won't understand the instructions. Pete replied, the reactor doesn't follow their computer models. It has what I call moods. Sometimes the plasma flow needs to be adjusted based on solar radiation from the nearby star. Sometimes it depends on gravitational fluctuations from passing ships. I've never been able to explain it in a way their logical minds can process. The evacuation continued throughout the day. In the communications center, Lieutenant Rick Davis erased all the human-designed protocols that kept the stations complex. Network running. The aliens had equivalent technology, but the human systems were designed to work around the quirks and limitations of alien hardware. The translation matrix is going to fail within a week, Rick warned Alex. It was designed by 3 different species that don't really understand how each other's technology works. I've been running background programs to compensate for the compatibility issues. In the marketplace, human trade negotiator Sarah Kim finished her last deal. She had been mediating a dispute between crystalline merchants and Void Runner buyers over the price of rare minerals. The argument had been going on for months, with both sides refusing to compromise. "I was so close to a solution," Sarah told Alex as they walked toward the docking bay. "The crystallines need the money to fund their hive expansion, but they're too proud to admit their prices are too high. The Void Runners actually want to pay more, but their culture requires them to negotiate aggressively to show respect for the seller. I just needed another week to help them save face while finding middle ground." Alex nodded but kept walking. Around them, alien beings were starting to notice the unusual activity. Humans were packing up their offices, saying goodbye to alien colleagues, and heading toward the docking bays with their personal belongings. The first transport ship arrived exactly on schedule. As the humans boarded, Alex took one last look around the station he had called home for so many years. In the main corridor, he could see alien security officers trying to access the human-designed computer systems. Warning lights were already flashing in several sections where automated systems were failing without human oversight. The second ship arrived 4 hours later. Dr. Walsh was among the last to board, tears streaming down her face. "I transferred the 3 Nixari children to their people's medical facility," she reported. "I gave the doctors all my notes and spent 3 hours explaining the treatment. They nodded and assured me they understood everything." Alex looked at her expression and knew the truth. The alien doctors had been too proud to admit they didn't understand. They would try to treat the children using standard Nexari medical protocols, which would fail. The children would die, and no one would understand why. As the transport ships prepared to depart, Alex received one final communication from the station's alien administrator. Prime Counselor Zekron had taken over command of Kepler Station and wanted assurance that all human systems would continue to function normally. Alex almost laughed at the absurdity of the request. "All systems are operating within normal parameters," he replied truthfully. The systems were running, for now, but without human intuition and adaptability to handle the countless small problems that arose every day. Normal parameters wouldn't last long. The transport ships engaged their engines and pulled away from Kepler Station. Through the viewport, Alex watched the massive structure grow smaller against the stars. He thought about all the successful negotiations that had taken place there, all the trade agreements that had brought prosperity to dozens of worlds, all the conflicts that had been resolved through patient human mediation. Within hours of the human evacuation, the first problems began. The fusion reactor that Pete Collins had been carefully maintaining started showing signs of instability. The communication systems that Rick Davis had kept running began experiencing translation errors. The marketplace that Sarah Kim had kept peaceful erupted into 3 separate arguments over trade disputes, but the humans were already gone, traveling through hyperspace toward their home system. Behind them, Kepler Station began its slide toward chaos, and with it, the careful balance that had kept dozens of species working together in harmony. Alex leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the future crumbling. 3 months had passed since the last human ship left alien space. Dr. Sam Rodriguez sat in his office on Earth, watching news reports from across the galaxy on multiple screens. The reports painted a picture of growing chaos that made his stomach turn. The Nexari-Zephyrian War had exploded into open conflict just 2 weeks after humanity's departure. For over a century, human diplomats had kept these 2 proud species from destroying each other. They had created buffer zones, negotiated trade agreements that made war too expensive, and found ways for both sides to claim victory in their disputes. Now the old hatred burned freely. Zephyrian battle cruisers attacked Nexari research stations. Nexari logic bombs crippled Zephyrian computer networks. Both sides had forgotten that their conflicts had solutions, because they had never needed to find those solutions themselves. Sam switched to another screen, showing economic data from the Galactic Trade Network. The numbers were worse than he had feared. The universal trade protocols that he had spent 15 years developing were failing across multiple sectors. The alien economists who had taken over his work did not understand the subtle adjustments needed to balance completely. Different economic systems. The crystalline hegemony operated on a hive mind economy where individual profit was meaningless. The Void Runners valued honor and reputation over material wealth. The Zephyrians hoarded resources as symbols of power. Sam had created a system that translated between these different values, allowing each species to trade in ways that made sense to their culture. Without those constant adjustments, the translation was breaking down. Crystalline merchants were accidentally insulting Void Runner traders by offering too much money, which suggested the goods were worthless. Zephyrian negotiators were demanding tribute that other species interpreted as theft. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for decades were shutting down as confusion and mistrust spread. Sam's assistant knocked on his door and entered with a worried expression. "Doctor, we're getting reports from the Titan Nebula. The research station there has gone dark." Sam pulled up the location on his display. Titan's Edge had been humanity's most ambitious joint research project with alien scientists. Dr. Tony Mitchell had worked there for 8 years, collaborating with the galaxy's brightest minds on experimental physics. The station was attempting to create artificial wormholes that could revolutionize space travel. "What kind of dark?" Sam asked. "Complete communication blackout. The last transmission was 3 days ago. A distress signal that cut off mid-sentence." Sam felt a chill run down his spine. Tony had warned him about this possibility during their last conversation. The alien scientists at Titan's Edge were brilliant theorists, but they struggled with practical application. Tony had been making tiny adjustments to their equipment every day, fixing problems that the aliens never even noticed were problems. Nexari see physics as pure mathematics, Tony had explained. They build equipment that should work perfectly according to their calculations. But reality is messy. Metal expands with heat. Gravity fluctuates. Cosmic radiation interferes. Sensitive instruments. I spend half my time compensating for variables they don't think are important enough to consider. Now Tony was gone, and the alien scientists were trying to run experiments with equipment they didn't fully understand. Sam suspected he knew what had happened at Titan's Edge, but he hoped he was wrong. Another screen showed reports from the Outer Rim territories. Captain Julie Adams had been responsible for updating the hyperspace navigation network that connected distant worlds. Her ship, the Star Walker, had mapped gravitational anomalies and solar wind patterns across thousands of light years. Without her constant updates, ships were getting lost. The hyperspace routes that seemed stable were actually shifting constantly as stars moved and gravity wells changed. Julie had intuitive understanding of how these forces interacted, knowledge that came from years of experience rather than textbook learning. The alien navigators who had taken over her work were following outdated maps. 7 ships had vanished in the past month, disappearing into hyperspace without any trace. The aliens were starting to avoid the outer routes entirely, cutting off dozens of remote colonies from contact with the rest of the galaxy. Sam switched to a medical report from the hegemony worlds. Dr. Claire Davis had been working there as a cultural exchange specialist, but Sam knew her real job. The crystalline beings shared a collective consciousness that sometimes became unstable. Individual minds would separate from the hive and go insane, or the entire collective would fragment into competing voices. Claire had been providing therapy, disguised as friendship. She would visit different crystalline communities and engage them in what appeared to be casual conversation. But her words were carefully chosen to reinforce the mental bonds that held their society together, showed increasing rates of what the crystallines called mind-breaking. Individual beings were losing connection with their collective and becoming violent or catatonic. Entire communities were splitting apart as different factions formed within the hive mind. The crystalline leaders were baffled by the sudden increase in mental illness among their people. A urgent message appeared on Sam's priority communication channel. It was from President Kate Adams, asking him to report to the Emergency Council meeting in 1 hour. Sam gathered his reports and headed toward the government building. The council chamber was filled with former human representatives from across the galaxy. Jake Morrison sat at the head of the table, looking older than Sam remembered. Captain Lisa Hayes presented intelligence reports from the remaining monitoring stations. The picture they painted was devastating. The Eternal Collective has announced their withdrawal from galactic affairs, Lisa reported. They're going into indefinite hibernation. Their final message was translated as the experiment has failed. We will sleep until stability returns. The Eternals were the oldest species in the galaxy, with lifespans measured in millions of years. If they were giving up on galactic civilization, it meant they believed the current crisis was permanent. What? About the Council's attempts to contact us? Jake asked. 17 official requests for human assistance in the past week, Lisa replied. High Counselor Vexstar is claiming that humanity's withdrawal was an emotional overreaction, and that we should return to our advisory roles for the good of galactic stability. Sam noticed that none of the messages mentioned equality or partnership. The aliens still believed humans should serve as helpers rather than equals. President Adams stood to address the group. The analysis teams have concluded that galactic civilization will collapse completely within 6 months if current trends continue. The question is whether we have any obligation to prevent that collapse. The room fell silent as everyone considered the implications. Outside the windows, Earth looked peaceful and prosperous. Humanity had redirected all the resources once spent on galactic affairs toward internal development. New cities were under construction, scientific research was advancing rapidly, and the first truly human colonies were being established in nearby star systems. They made their choice, Jake said quietly. They decided they were better off without human interference. Maybe we should let them prove it. Sam looked around the room at faces he had worked with for decades. These people had dedicated their lives to building a better galaxy. Now they had to decide whether that galaxy deserved to be saved. The meeting continued late into the night, but Sam already knew what the decision would be. Humanity had learned a hard lesson about the difference between being wanted and being used. They would not make that mistake again. 6 months after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, High Counselor Vexstar stood alone in his private chambers on the Zephyrian homeworld. Through the crystal windows, he could see smoke rising from the capital city below. His own people were fighting in the streets over food rations and energy allocations. The proud Zephyrian civilization that had lasted for 10,000 years was collapsing from within. Trade routes that had brought prosperity for centuries were closed. The hyperspace network that connected Zephyrian worlds was failing, leaving entire planets isolated and desperate. The war with the Nexari had consumed resources that his people could no longer afford to lose. Vexstar's communication device buzzed with another urgent message from his military commander. General Coulter's words were blunt and terrifying. My Lord, we have lost contact with 15 more colonies in the Outer Rim. The supply ships cannot navigate the hyperspace routes without human guidance. Our own navigation computers are useless beyond the inner system. The truth that Vexstar had refused to acknowledge was becoming impossible to ignore. The humans had not been servants performing simple tasks. They had been the foundation that held galactic civilization together, and without them, everything. Was crumbling. Another message arrived from the Nexari homeworld. Dr. Nexel Prime had spent months trying to mathematically recreate human decision-making processes. His latest report was devastating in its honesty. Analysis complete. Human emotional responses generate solutions that pure logic cannot achieve. Their intuitive thinking operates on variables we cannot identify or quantify. Conclusion: human. Problem-solving ability cannot be replicated by any known species. Vexstar deleted the message without responding. Admitting that the Nexari were correct would mean admitting that he had been wrong about everything. His pride had cost the galaxy its stability, but his pride also prevented him from accepting that reality. Across the galaxy on the Void Runner homeworld, War Master Grakthul faced a crisis that threatened his entire species. The proud warrior, culture that had conquered dozens of star systems, was watching their children die from diseases that human doctors had easily cured. Just months earlier, the Void Runner medical facilities were designed for treating battle injuries, not complex illnesses. They had relied on human hospitals and human doctors for advanced medical care. Now those humans were gone, and the Void Runners were discovering that their own medical knowledge was centuries behind what they needed. Grakthul's own son was dying from quantum flux syndrome, the same disease that Dr. Jenny Walsh had treated successfully for years. The Void Runner doctors had tried every treatment in their databases, but nothing worked. The boy grew weaker each day while his father watched helplessly. For the first time in Void Runner history, Grakthul composed a message to Earth. The words were simple and desperate. Human healers, our children are dying. Our worlds are failing. The Void Runners were wrong to dismiss your value. We ask for your help, not as masters demanding service, but as parents begging for mercy. A message was sent through the few remaining communication relays that still functioned. Grakthul received an automated response, confirming that Earth had received his transmission, but no human replied to his plea. On the research station that had once been called Titan's Edge, the few surviving alien scientists huddled in the emergency shelter and waited for rescue that would never come. The experimental wormhole generator had exploded 3 weeks earlier, destroying half the station and killing dozens of researchers. The accident had happened exactly as Dr. Tony Mitchell had predicted it would. The alien scientists had continued their experiments without understanding the constant adjustments that Tony had made to keep the equipment stable. They had followed their mathematical models perfectly, but mathematics could not account for the countless small variables that Tony's human intuition had managed effortlessly. The survivors were slowly running out of food and air while there. Distress signals went unanswered. The Galactic Rescue Services had collapsed along with everything else, leaving them stranded in space with no hope of escape. Back on Earth, Fleet Admiral Grace Thompson reviewed the daily intelligence reports. In her office at Space Command Headquarters, the reports painted a picture of total civilizational collapse. It was both tragic and predictable. The crystalline hegemony had fragmented into 17 different factions, each claiming to be the true voice of their collective consciousness. Without Dr. Claire Davis's subtle psychological support, their hive mind had shattered under the stress of the galactic crisis. The fragments were now at war with each other, using their advanced technology to commit genocide against their own species. The Eternal Collective had sealed themselves in stasis chambers for what they called the long sleep. Their final transmission had been haunting in its finality. We have witnessed the rise and fall of 1,000 civilizations. Never before has the removal of one species caused such complete disruption. We will sleep until the universe finds balance again, even if that takes 1,000,000 years. Grace's aide entered with another stack of messages from the failing galactic government. The remaining council members were offering humanity increasingly desperate bargains for their return. Complete control over galactic affairs, unlimited resources for human development, even the right to rule other species as humanity. Saw fit. Each offer revealed how little the aliens still understood about human nature. They assumed that humans had withdrawn out of wounded pride or desire for power. They could not comprehend that humanity had simply grown tired of being used and discarded by people who claimed to be their betters. "Admiral," her aide said quietly, "we're receiving reports of refugee ships heading toward the Sol system. Alien civilians fleeing the chaos in their own territories." Grace nodded grimly. She had been expecting this development. As galactic civilization collapsed, desperate beings would naturally turn toward the one place that still seemed stable and prosperous. Earth had become a beacon of hope in a galaxy falling into darkness. "What are our orders regarding the refugees?" her aide asked. Grace considered the question carefully. These were not the proud council members who had dismissed humanity as primitive servants. These were ordinary beings whose only crime was trusting their leaders to make wise decisions. But accepting them would mean taking responsibility for their welfare, and humanity had already learned the cost of such responsibility. Monitor their approach, but do not respond to their communications, Grace decided. Humanity is no longer responsible for solving the galaxy's problems. Through her office window, Grace could see the lights of Luna City gleaming on the surface of Earth's moon. Construction ships moved between the orbital stations that had become humanity's new frontier. In the distance, the first-generation ship was taking shape, designed to carry human colonists to distant galaxies where they could build something new. Humanity had spent 3 centuries trying to hold alien civilizations together. Now they were focused on building something that belonged entirely to them. The universe was vast, and there were countless worlds waiting to be explored by beings who understood the value of cooperation over domination. The old galaxy could keep its pride and its prejudices. Humanity had found something better than ruling others: the freedom to rule themselves. 1 year after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, Ambassador Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of the starship New Horizon and watched a blue sun rise over an alien world. This planet had no name in the old galactic databases, because no council species had ever bothered to explore this far beyond their established territories. The beings who lived here called themselves the Keepers, and they had welcomed humanity with genuine curiosity and respect. Unlike the proud council species, the Keepers asked questions instead of making demands. They wanted to learn from human experiences rather than use human abilities for their own benefit. Captain Lisa Hayes joined Jake at the viewing window, carrying a datapad filled with reports from their ongoing diplomatic mission. "The Keepers have agreed to the cultural exchange program," she said with satisfaction. "They're sending 50 of their scholars to Earth, and we're establishing a permanent research station here." Jake smiled as he watched Keeper ships moving gracefully through the atmosphere below. These vessels used technology that was completely different from anything in Council space, powered by controlled gravity fields rather than fusion reactors. The Keepers had offered to share their knowledge freely, asking only that humans do the same. "Any word from the old galaxy?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Lisa's expression grew somber. "The final council session was held last week. Only 12 species attended out of the original 47. They voted to dissolve the Galactic Council permanently." The news was not surprising, but it still carried weight. An institution that had lasted for thousands of years was ending because its members had forgotten the difference between service and slavery. The council species had valued human contributions only as long as humans remained in subordinate positions. High Counselor Vextar sent one last message before the dissolution, Lisa continued. "He's offering humanity complete control over what remains of galactic civilization. Full authority to rebuild the government however we see fit." Jake shook his head sadly. Even in defeat, The aliens still didn't understand. They thought the crisis was about power and control, not respect and equality. Vexstar believed that offering to serve human interests would tempt humanity back to their old role. "Did we respond?" Jake asked. President Adams sent a brief reply. Lisa said she thanked them for the offer and wished them well in their future endeavors. Nothing more. Through the viewport, Jake could see human and keeper scientists working together on joint research projects. There was no hierarchy here, no assumption that one species was naturally superior to another. The collaboration was based on mutual benefit and genuine friendship. A communication alert chimed from the bridge. Captain Rick Davis's voice came through the ship's speakers. "Ambassador Morrison, we're receiving a transmission from deep space. It's coming from beyond the galactic rim." Jake and Lisa made their way to the bridge, where Rick was analyzing the incoming signal. The message was audio only, transmitted on an old emergency frequency that hadn't been used in decades. "This is Dr. Ben Rodriguez, transmitting from the exploration ship Far Wanderer," the voice said through crackling static. "We've made contact with a previously unknown civilization in the Andromeda approach. They call themselves the Builders, and they've been watching our galaxy for centuries." Jake felt his pulse quicken. Ben had been leading humanity's deep space exploration program, pushing farther into unknown regions than any species had ever traveled. His mission was to find new worlds for human settlement, far from the influence of the old council species. The transmission continued. "The Builders are ancient, possibly older than the Eternals, but they never involved themselves in galactic politics. They're fascinated by humanity's approach to problem-solving and want to establish formal contact. I'm sending coordinates for a meeting point." Lisa was already plotting the location on the navigation charts. "It's 3 months away at maximum hyperspace speed," she reported. "Completely outside any previously explored territory." Jake made his decision quickly. "Set course for the coordinates. Send word to Earth that we're extending our mission." As the New Horizon changed course toward the meeting point, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought humanity to this moment. A year ago, they had been struggling to maintain peace in a galaxy that saw them as useful servants. Now they were exploring uncharted space and forming partnerships with civilizations that valued their unique perspective. The old galaxy was dying behind them. The Nexari-Zephyrian War had consumed both species, leaving their worlds in ruins. The crystalline hegemony had shattered into warring fragments that would never reunite. The Void Runners were slowly going extinct, as their medical knowledge proved. Inadequate for their survival needs, but humanity was thriving. Earth's population was growing as resources once spent on galactic affairs were redirected toward human development. New colonies were being established throughout the local star cluster. Most importantly, humans were rediscovering their own potential without the constant need to prove themselves to dismissive aliens. 3 weeks into their journey toward the meeting point, they encountered something unexpected. A small alien vessel was drifting powerless in deep space, far from any inhabited system. The ship's design was unfamiliar, clearly belonging to a species not found in Council databases. "Life signs are weak but stable," reported Dr. Jenny Walsh, who had joined the mission as Chief Medical Officer. "Looks like 4 beings in some kind of emergency stasis." Jake ordered the rescue of the stranded aliens. As they were brought aboard the New Horizon, Jenny worked to revive them safely. The beings were tall and graceful, with silver skin that seemed to shimmer with internal light. When the first alien awakened, his words were translated by the ship's computer. "You are the humans we have heard about," he said with obvious relief. "I am Scholar Veltar of the Seekers. Our ship was damaged while fleeing the chaos in Council space." Jake introduced himself and asked about the Seekers' situation. Veltar's story was familiar but tragic. His people had been a minor species in the old council, valued for their historical knowledge, but given little political influence. When the galactic government collapsed, larger species had tried to conquer seeker worlds to claim their archives and libraries. "We are wanderers now," Veltar explained. "We carry the accumulated knowledge of 100 dead civilizations, but we have no home to preserve it." Lisa leaned forward with interest. "What kind of knowledge?" Veltar's eyes brightened. "Art, literature, philosophy, science." The council species saw us as living libraries, useful for storing information they might need someday. But knowledge without purpose is meaningless. We seek beings who will use wisdom to build something better than what came before. Jake exchanged glances with Lisa and saw his own thoughts reflected in her expression. Here was another species that had been undervalued by the council, another group of beings who understood the difference between being used and being respected. "The Seekers are welcome to travel with us," Jake said formally. "We're going to meet with a new civilization, one that values knowledge and cooperation. Perhaps you'll find what you're looking for." As the new horizon continued toward its meeting with the builders, Jake stood once again at the observation deck and looked out at the stars. Behind them lay a galaxy in ruins, destroyed by pride and prejudice. Ahead lay infinite possibilities. For beings wise enough to learn from the past, the universe had not crumbled because humanity walked away from the council. It had crumbled because the council had never truly appreciated what humanity freely gave. Now, in the vast darkness between galaxies, new alliances were forming based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Humanity had found its place among the stars, not as servants pretending to be partners, but as equals building something magnificent together.